Well, welcome everybody. We're very glad you're here for our presentation on the Lowdown on low water plants. Sally and I both love the beauty that we find in nature. We love plants, we love to garden, we love to read, we love to learn, and we love to share our passions with others. And so our goal for this class today is to introduce you to some great plants for Colorado and inspire you to spend more time in your gardens. So as we consider xeriscape plant selection in our gardens, we need to consider plants for our gardens. We need to know our terms. Xeriscaping generally embraces plants that are considered xeric or drought tolerant. But there's a difference between drought tolerance and drought resistance. Drought tolerance is the ability of a plant to withstand drought without dying. Drought resistance is a plant that can endure drought and still look good. Drought is subjective, and it's a relative term to the area in which you live. And the actual definition for drought is a long period of no rain, and thankfully we're getting rain tonight, or the absence of rain. So how dry is dry, or how low can we go with our water? There's two different schools of thought. The first school is dryland gardening. This is the purest level of xeriscaping, or xeriscape plants, I guess, where you would consider no additional water on your plants, little to no soil amendments, and using only native or adapted plants for your growing environment. And you will see these symbols throughout the presentation with a little water drop and the X through it, or the N. The little water drop means that it will survive, or it's drought resistant. It will actually look good without additional water once established. The N means that it's a native plant for Colorado. But for the purpose of this presentation tonight, we are going to focus on water-wise and adaptable gardening, using the xeriscape principles for plant selection. And there's three of these principles that apply primarily to choosing plants in our gardens. The first one is planning and design. And this can be done on your own as you evaluate what you have, what you want to do. It can be done with the assistance of a designer. But the main thing is that we want to look at what our goals are. Are we trying to create just some beauty in our garden? Do we need to have some function, a screen for wind or screening out of view? Maybe we want to have a focal point. We want to look at what is it we want from our gardens. Secondly, we want to look at our environmental conditions that we're growing in. And that might be the sun exposure that we have, the wind exposure that we have, the soil conditions that we have. Maybe we have a change in grade, that we have slopes we're dealing with, or water that drains through our property. These are all things that we have to consider as we choose our plants. And when we think about the soil issues, soil improvement is one of the principles of xeriscaping. We want to consider, even when we're using native plants or plants that will thrive without any additional water, we need to consider doing something to the soil. Many of our soils have become compacted in construction or over time, and plants that can thrive with little water don't necessarily thrive with little oxygen around their roots. So the most important thing that we can do for any of our plants that we plant, whether we choose to amend the soil with compost or not, is to loosen that soil so that air can be around those root systems. The other thing we want to consider in our plan is microclimates. And microclimates may be created by structures in our home, maybe structures in the landscape, maybe shade from existing trees. Rocks can create microclimates. We can create our own microclimates. If we want to have a rock garden, we can add rocks into our garden. And we also want to consider what is our access to water. Is this an area that we do plan on watering? Is it an existing area that we're watering? And how will we water these plants through establishment? The second thing that we want to consider in the xeriscape principles is the limited turf. And the reason I say that is because there are so many plants that are so wonderful and so little space to put them in our gardens. And if we limit our turf, we can save water, conserve water through using xeriscape plants, and we have more place to put some of these beautiful plants. And then that leads us to the right plant for the right place. When we know this information, what our goals are, what are the environmental conditions in which we are working in, and whether we're going to irrigate or not, and we've created room, then we can look at selecting the plant. We also want to consider hydrozoning so that the plants that we select have similar water requirements. And the hydrozoning, from the purpose of this this presentation, most of the plants that we will be introducing you to are going to be in the low to moderate range. Again, you will see some very low water plants throughout this that'll be noted with the water drop in the native. But you want to put plants that have the same water requirement together. So if you have a high water plant, you do not want to put that next to a very low water plant. You will not be able to create the right growing conditions for both of those plants. But you can place plants side by side that are similar or right next to each other in the water requirement. So a low water plant can go next to a moderate water plant, or a very low water plant next to a low water plant, or moderate next to a high. You just can't go on the opposite ends of the extreme. And you can also consider creating dry pockets. So you may have a landscape bed that's existing that you have some shrubs and trees planted in that have a drip irrigation to them, but you may want to add some interesting texture or other plants in there that you choose not to water, and you can do that. You just create a little area that you're going to plant, loosen your soil, and you put in plants that don't need any extra water. So those plants would do well, but not next to a bluegrass lawn where it was getting overwatered. So those are things to consider. And with that, we will start with part one of our program, which is woody plants. And I'm going to introduce you to some of my favorites for Colorado and discuss some of the interesting features and uses for the garden. This first plant is the Bigtooth Maple Acer granitatum. This is my absolute favorite tree for Colorado. This is a native tree. It is native to the foothills in the montane. It is a kissing cousin to the sugar maple. It is an excellent tree to use as an aspen alternative. Aspen, by the way, for those of you that are aspen lovers, really do not do well at our elevation here. If you're up in the foothills, they do wonderful, but they are susceptible to many problems here at this elevation. So we consider plants that we can use that will give us great features. This particular one does that. It starts out very columnar in its youth, and then it broadens out, as you can see on the second picture, with age, getting to about 25 to 30 foot tall and about 20 foot wide. In the fall, it turns beautiful colors, depending on how long the fall season is. It starts out yellow, turns orange, and then all the way to red if we have an extended season. This is by far my favorite tree. This right here is a Tatarian maple, another excellent small ornamental tree for our gardens. Again, a fairly low water plant, tolerates heavy clay, multi-seasons of interest. This tree makes a samara that is red, and you can see it in the center lower part of the slide. It actually looks like it's blooming around the 4th of July. The picture of the tree that is green actually has the little samaras on it, and then the other two pictures, you can see the variance in fall color on this tree depending on the season. It goes from orange, yellow to a burgundy red. Absolutely wonderful tree. This particular tree is one that was found up at the Cheyenne Experimental Station, and then developed through Fort Collins Nursery from a chance seedling that happened to have bright red colors on the samara. But for those of you that don't know, the Cheyenne Experimental Station in Cheyenne was developed back in the 20s to do experiments on plants for the high plains. And it was abandoned in the 70s, and most of the plants died. I think 50 to 80% of those plants didn't make it. But Fort Collins Nursery has gone up and done some research on what they call the survivors, and those are the really tough plants. They've been left with no pruning, no water, no care, out on the plains of Cheyenne, and if anything can survive there, they certainly can survive here. This is one of those plants. Autumn Brilliant Serviceberry is another small ornamental tree that is a beautiful tree for 4 seasons of interest. You get a white spring bloom on this thing. It's just starting to open up right now. From there, you get a berry that is red and then changes to purple that the robins will come and eat almost immediately. They don't last on the tree very long, but it's a lot of fun to watch them. So if you're looking to attract wildlife to your garden, this is a fun tree to have. And then it has a beautiful fall color that is red to orange, and very interesting winter interest, as you can see in that lower picture from the branch structure on it. The Western Catalpa tree is another great tree. It's a tall large shade tree for our area. Very interesting feel to it. It is a very tropical looking tree. It's a very large heart-shaped leaf, a very beautiful white orchid type flower, and it tolerates our dry clay and does really well here in Colorado. And you can see it does make a pod after the flowers, and the picture in the lower right is that tree in the winter time, which really gives you some interest in the winter, but does require a little bit of cleanup once those pods fall in the spring. But it certainly is worth it for the beauty that that tree can bring to your garden. It'll get very large, 50, 60 foot tall, but it stays a little bit more narrow, maybe 20, 30 foot wide. So it's a great tree to use in smaller landscapes. This is the common hackberry. This is what we would call a workhorse tree. This tree here is industrial, used many times in street plantings. It tolerates heavy clay, drought, abuse of all sorts. Has a very interesting rough bark to it as it matures. It has a very sweet fruit that the birds like to come after that holds on the tree. It's persistent, stays through the winter. It does sometimes get nipple gall on the foliage, which you will see in that lower picture on the right, but it is only a cosmetic thing. It is not hurtful to the tree. So for those very industrial sites that are neglected, this is an excellent large shade tree to use. Russian hawthorn is a very interesting character tree. This is one that you either love or you hate. It has great character. It's kind of gnarly in its growth, and it has a white flower in the spring, and it makes an interesting red cranberry type berry that you can see that holds into the winter until the birds come and eat it. Again, an excellent tree to attract birds to the garden and to bring interesting character if that is what you like. This is also a plant that would survive with no additional water once established, and it's also one that is a survivor up at the Cheyenne Experimental Station. But if you're not into such gnarly character, it has a cousin, which is the thornless cockspur hawthorn, which is another beautiful ornamental tree, nice lollipop, tidy shape to it that has all those same wonderful features that the Russian hawthorn have. White flowers in the spring, red berries late into the season, and then beautiful red fall color. The Imperial Thornless Honeylocust is another great shade tree for our area. This particular variety tends to be a little bit more symmetrical in its shape. It is thornless and it is also podless. Makes a great shade tree, provides a filtered shade, has a fine texture to it. The leaves are small, and you can see its winter form in the picture on your right. But this is another great tree, I think another one of the workhorse trees for shade trees for here in northern Colorado. The Kentucky coffee tree has a very interesting form to it. This particular tree will get to be very large. It has a white flower on it, if it is the female tree, and then creates an interesting pod, which you can see that holds on through the winter. This is another very industrial tree, tolerates our heavy clay very well. It tolerates drought very well and wind. It is just a super large shade tree for our area. Has some interesting stories behind this tree. The people in Kentucky and some of the Native Americans in that area take these coffee beans, or used to take these coffee beans and roast them, or beans, and make coffee out of them, hence the name Kentucky coffee tree. But what is interesting about this is that the leaves and the pods and the flowers and all parts of this tree are poisonous. But apparently when you roast these beans, it neutralizes the poisons in that and makes them tolerable to be consumed as a coffee drink. And actually the Native Americans used it they would crush those seeds after roasted and use them for some type of a food. But there have been incidences where these leaves and pods and things have fallen into small areas of water, reservoirs of water, and actually killed the fish in the water and poisoned the water. So if these things are not roasted, you would not want to consume them. This next tree is a wafer ash, and this is another great ornamental tree for Colorado. It has it makes a little small wafer. The flower is insignificant on it, but it makes an interesting wafer that is persistent and hangs on the tree. So it gives you some interesting texture. A very hardy, native, drought-tolerant tree. When you crush the leaves in your fingers, it actually emits a smell like hops. So sometimes this tree is called the hop tree. But for an ornamental, small, focal point tree, or in a hardy place where you're really looking to reduce your water, this tree is an excellent choice. Has beautiful golden fall color that mimics what the aspens do in the fall. So another great tree to consider for an aspen alternative. The Gambel oak is one of our natives, native to the foothills to the montane. It would survive, or actually be a drought-resistant tree, so it will actually thrive without additional water once established. In its native environment, it grows in groves or clumps, as you can see in both of the pictures on the left. One during the summer, and the one with the russet color is what it looks like in the fall. The tree on the right is one actually in my yard. Its suckering as it forms a colony is not a problem. Typically, it just becomes a multi-stem tree that you can then limb up some of those lower branches and have an interesting form of a tree. The leaves on this hold through the winter also, so that if you're using this for a screen in an industrial site where you really put it out there and you're not going to care for it a lot, those leaves on that tree will help to provide to screen through the winter. And it makes a small acorn also that squirrels and other animals, it's good forage for some of the wild animals. The bur oak is a very stately, large shade tree that is excellent for our area. Again, tolerating heavy clay, tolerating very low water, takes the wind. It becomes a very large tree. It has a very interesting gnarly bark that is black. In the wintertime, you can pick these trees out. It is very stately. It has a very large, deeply lobed leaf. It makes a large acorn that has an interesting fringed cap to it. So for another large shade tree for our area, this tree here is well adapted for northern Colorado. This tree here, the Chinquapin oak, is one that probably is not so easily found in the area. It is found, but this comes from my Texas roots. I grew up in Texas and learned about plants there and then moved here as an adult. And the Chinquapin oak in the next slide that I'm going to show you, the Shumard Red Oak or the Quercus bucklei, is another variety, are oak trees that I think are well worthy of consideration for our area. They would be low to moderate water users, so these would not be trees here in Colorado that could be grown without additional irrigation, but they have an interesting form and growth pattern, very interesting leaves. The Chinquapin oak, you can see, is more of a serrated edge, has kind of a russet fall color, and it tends to grow a little bit taller than it does wider. Also, both of these trees tend to be a little bit faster growing for oak trees, and I think they're an excellent tree to consider for growing here in Colorado. This one here is the Shumard Red Oak, and both of these trees are planted right outside of our gardens on Spring Creek here in Fort Collins. This is planted in the Lauren Springer strip along the, I guess, was that the south side, southeast side? And these are the Shumard Red Oaks, and you can see these leaves are finely cut, very nice form to the tree, and the brilliant scarlet red fall color. Certainly a tree to consider. This one is just Shumardi. Wavyleaf oak is another one of our natives. Now this is a little bit smaller tree in its habit. It can either be grown in a single stem or a multi-stem, as you see in these two pictures here. It has a thick leathery leaf to it that's kind of bluish green, and then in the fall, in the warmest winters, it may stay semi-evergreen. But in the fall, it'll turn, you can see in the picture on the left, kind of a golden brown, and it does hold its foliage again all the way through the winter until it starts its new growth in the spring. A great tree for a totally dry garden in our area. So now we're on to evergreen trees, and I think it's important in our gardens that we have a good balance of evergreen and deciduous plants to help carry us through the winter, to give us the structure. And so there's some wonderful trees that are xeric that we can use in our gardens. The first one I'll introduce you to is our Rocky Mountain juniper. And there are many cultivars available. On this particular slide, you can see the Colo Green, the Wichita Blue, or the Woodward Columnar. The Woodward Columnar is actually another Cheyenne survivor, only getting about 2.5 foot wide and growing 25 or so foot tall. You can see it actually is a great tree to use as a replacement for Italian cypress. That was another plant we used a lot down south for those exclamation points in the garden when you really want to make an impact, a vertical accent. It's a great tree to do that. The other junipers, and there's many cultivars out there in the Scopulorum species, are great workhorse trees, but they also provide an interesting foliage contrast, as you can see, with blue playing off a green, or if you have a red shrub. But you can also use them for wind blocks, so they have good use for screening, and they also have nice berries that the animals, or the birds, really like to come and eat throughout the winter, so it provides good food for the wildlife. This here is the juniper, chinensis, or the Spartan juniper. This one here is a little different variety than our native. However, it has a beautiful deep green color and a wonderful blueberry. So this is a great tree as an accent piece, as you can see here in the yard. And again, excellent food source for the birds. And it has, this one here tends to stay a little bit more narrow than some of our native varieties, so it is good for a smaller landscape. Colorado blue spruce. This is our wonderful state tree. And there's many varieties of this tree, and it provides beautiful blue color. It is actually considered a xeric plant, but it is a moderate water user. It is native along stream sides in our mountains, where they do get considerable more precipitation than we get down here. So this would require some supplemental water, but certainly a tree that is worth considering. A few of the cultivars that are unusual are the pendula, which is a weeping form of the Colorado blue spruce. This can be used over boulders or cascading over walls or on slopes, creates an interesting cascading effect with its growth pattern. The fastigate on the far right is actually a columnar version, only getting about 6 to 8 foot wide maximum, but growing still quite tall, 25 feet tall. One thing that I should mention about evergreens when you're purchasing them at the nursery, they give you a tag that will tell you how large these trees are going to get. The one in the lower center is called a Montgomery, and on the tag, when you buy this thing, it's going to tell you it gets 6 to 8 foot by 6 to 8 foot, with a pyramidal, teardrop type of a shape to its growth. But evergreens never stop growing. You can control how they grow by pinching off the leaders on it, and also by how much water it's getting is going to affect that somewhat. But it will continue to grow. The size that they give you on the tag is a 10-year size. There is a Montgomery in my old house planted 17 years ago that is every bit of 12 foot tall and probably 8 foot to 10 foot wide at the base. So know that these plants will continue to grow. What they rate them by is how fast they grow. Some are super slow growers, only growing 1 to 2 inches a year, and others that are fast growers growing 12 to 18 inches a year. I believe the Montgomery falls in a moderate range, maybe 6 to 12 or 4 to 6. I guess I'm not really positive there, but so it doesn't get real large, but it will eventually become a larger plant than you see in this picture. And then we have fat and wide, like Fat Albert. And another great one to consider, I think, for the urban landscape is the Baker's blue spruce. The Baker's tends to be a little bit more narrow, maybe getting anywhere from 8 to 12 foot wide in maturity, but you can see by its form that this would be a tree that you could use in a smaller space, still giving you that beautiful steely blue color. So now we go into the pines, and this first pine that I'm going to introduce you to is the bristlecone pine. This particular pine is native to the higher elevations in Colorado. It is a pine that does require good drainage. It is also a drought-resistant plant, so once established would survive without additional water and still look good. You can see it in these pictures here in its young age with an interesting rich green. It has a white resin on the needles that give it an interesting texture. And then you can see it mature on the right. That tree probably there is probably at least 30 years old. It is a very slow growing pine tree, but an excellent choice for a totally dry or xeric garden. You would not want this tree planted next to your bluegrass lawn. It would not be happy. The pinyon pine is another native pine to Colorado, grows on the southern slopes in the foothills, primarily out in the western part of the state. Again, a drought-resistant plant, would thrive without additional water once established. You can see it has a nice, tidy shape to it, very dense form, a little bit shorter needle, makes an interesting pine cone. And from this tree, we get our pine nuts that we roast and put in salads and other type of casseroles if you like the pine nuts. I think gathering the pine nuts from the pine cones is quite the process, but that is the tree where the pine nut comes from. The limber pine is another excellent native pine tree that is native to the higher elevations in Colorado, very hardy, tolerates the wind, tolerates heavy clay, tolerates drought, tolerates just about anything you could throw its way. This is probably one that could have had a water drop on it also. The only reason I didn't put the no water is because it is from higher elevations, which typically do get a little bit more moisture than we get here. But this tree is a workhorse of a pine tree. You usually see it multi-stem, has an interesting rich green needle to it, and you can see it is a little bit longer pine cone down in the lower right-hand corner. The limber pine has also, there are some cultivars that can be used for smaller gardens or rock gardens. There are two varieties here, the Damfino dwarf, which it would be a rock garden pine. This would be one of those super slow growers, probably only growing 1 to 2 inches per year, having a nice moundy form to it. Probably was developed from a broom that was taken from, it was an abnormal growth on a pine tree that was found, and then it's grafted to create these, to propagate it so that you can use these in your garden. The Glenmore dwarf or Glenmore columnar is also an excellent choice for narrow places in our garden, and this you can see in its form that it stays fairly narrow, only getting maybe 3 to 5 foot wide maximum in its age, and a great tree for accents in your garden, vertical accents. But you want to know your source when you're buying limber pines. There is another limber pine that's quite popular called Vanderwolf. It has a long needle on it that's kind of bluish green. But many of these cultivars are propagated and put onto different rootstock. These particular ones that I'm showing here are actually placed onto rootstock of, I believe, the native limber pine, so they're very, very hardy. But most of the Vanderwolf limber pines that come our way are grafted onto eastern white pine. They're coming from the western states, and they're grafted onto eastern white pine rootstock, which is not a rootstock that tolerates our clay or our water, the alkali soil and water that we have. So, how do you spell that name? The Vanderwolf. It's Vander, V-A-N-D-E-R, and then Wolf, W-O-L-F. There are some suppliers that are grafting those onto limber pine rootstock, and certainly those would be hardy for our area. Just know your source. The Ponderosa pine is a native plant here to Colorado, again growing in the foothills to the montane. Beautiful, long, green, soft needles. Has a beautiful red bark to it. And the way you can tell the Ponderosa pine apart from the Austrian pine, because there's many Austrian pines planted in our area, is that the Ponderosa pine has 3 needles. The needles are a little bit longer, and your Austrian pine is only going to be a 2-needle pine. But this tree here is very hardy. It doesn't adapt as well to urban conditions, so not a very good street tree, but maybe more in, on acreage properties where you can give it the right growing conditions. This is a great native tree to use, but it is a moderate water user because of where it's native to, so it will need some supplemental water to thrive. There are also some Ponderosa pine cultivars. This particular one is called Mary Ann Heacock, and I believe her namesake was Mary Ann Heacock, who found this plant up in the Poudre Canyon and grew it in her yard for many years, and then passed it on to Kelly Gremmons with Timberline Gardens when she moved out of her home, and that's what you see is the parent tree there on the right. That tree, I believe, is somewhere between 80 and 100 years old. It is a genetic dwarf, and it has been propagated, so you can now purchase through some of the local nurseries these Mary Ann Heacocks, and generally when you purchase them, you see them as the picture on the left there. It's a nice little moundy form, very, very slow grower. So a great rock garden plant or just a small accent evergreen to put maybe by your front door if you want to have an evergreen plant there or someplace as a focal point. But again, very slow growing, so it'll stay very small, and a great tree to use in the urban landscape. The southwestern white pine is a pine I think is underused. It is also probably not quite as readily available, but I think an excellent pine to consider for our area. It too, like the Vanderwolf pine, has a very long, soft needle. Those needles can get 6 to 7 inches long, blue-green. The texture on it is fine and silky. Very hardy tree, tolerates clay and alkali and wind. And it is beautiful form, as you can see here in this picture. So if you can get your hands on one of these, and I know there's several places that are selling them, this is a great tree for something different that your neighbors don't all have. So now we're on to deciduous shrubs, and there are many of those that are worthy of our consideration. The first one is the Saskatoon Serviceberry, and this is a cousin to the serviceberry, the first serviceberry that we looked at, which was the Autumn Brilliance, but this one is more of a shrub form, and this is a native plant, native to the foothills, to the montane. It has a beautiful white flower and the berries that start red and turn to blue, and it has excellent fall colors. You can see in that picture there, beautiful red fall color. The birds absolutely love this plant. The Indians use the berries, I believe, to make pemmican, and you can also make jams and jelly from these berries if you can get your hands on them before the birds do. I believe another name for this plant is Juneberry. And so I know in the early pioneer days, many pioneer women made jam out of these berries, fighting the birds off, I'm sure. Dwarf Leadplant is an excellent native, no water plant for Colorado. This is the Nana variety. It only gets about 2 foot tall and 2 foot wide. It has beautiful spiky purple flowers in the summer. Nice fine texture to the foliage. It's kind of a grayish green or bluish green. And many of our native plants, you will find some of these features on them, that they have small foliage, which reduces the amount of evaporation. Some of these plants you'll see will have fine hairs on them to kind of shade the foliage of the plant, the leaf or the stem. Many of them will have deep tap roots. Also succulent foliage is a common. But this one here you can see, and it's fine foliage. And the other thing with really fine or narrow foliage is it also protects it against hail, because the hail will just kind of go right through it. Whereas if you've ever seen what happens to a rhubarb leaf when you have a hailstorm, you've got Swiss cheese. So this plant here would certainly tolerate just about anything you would throw its way except too much water. Carigana is another workhorse plant. This is commonly used, the Siberian pea shrub is used commonly as a screening plant. I think it has excellent qualities, a beautiful yellow flower in the spring. It has a very shiny golden bark, as you can see in the center. This plant is drought resistant and will thrive without additional water once established. The tidy pea shrub on the right is one that is actually a survivor from Cheyenne. It has a little bit more open and airy feel to it, almost like a Palo Verde if you're familiar from Arizona. But you can see it in bloom on this picture here. And then the pygmy pea shrub for more of a small dwarf bush, that one only getting about probably 4 foot tall and wide. The tidy will get about 8 foot wide and probably maybe 10 foot tall. And the Carigana, I believe, is about 12 foot tall and about 8 foot wide. The Siberian pea shrub. But these are excellent plants for multi-seasons of interest that can actually thrive without additional water. So when we look at a dryland garden, these would be great plants to incorporate into it. And you can, again, combine your colors. So you have this bright green and the yellow flowers, and you have something next to that with a bluish foliage to it, different textures, and you can get a lot of visual interest. Yes? I have not noticed that there's a problem with that particular one. I know it does not sucker as much as some of the other varieties are known to sucker, so it tends to be more tidy, but I have not noticed a problem with the pods exploding. Carol Mackey Daphne is a plant select plant for here in Colorado, and I think an excellent choice for the urban garden. It has a beautiful variegated foliage on it, so it's a nice foliage contrast to many of our other plants. It has a nice, very fragrant light pink flower in the spring. This plant will get about 3 to 4 foot tall and 3 to 4 foot wide. And it would prefer to have a little bit of shade or some protection from the wind. Although I have seen them on very exposed sites and they seem to do well, but the preferred growing environment would maybe on the north or the northeast side of your home. This is a great small plant to use in the landscape. Rock Spirea is another wonderful native. You can see it on the left here in its native environment, foothills to the montane. And Sally has actually incorporated this into her home garden next to her Winnipeg Parks rose. What a stunning photo. This is a great Spirea that will grow here without a lot of additional care or water and give you beautiful spiky flowers in the spring and an interesting form in your garden. This particular plant will grow about 4 to 5 foot tall and equally as wide. Summer wine 9-bark is a great shrub. You can see that it almost has a growth habit of the bridal wreath with that cascading branches coming from it. But my favorite feature on this plant right here is its red foliage. Throughout the season, that red foliage plays off so well with blues and greens in different colors. But then you have the added bonus in the spring with these beautiful light pink flowers. And in the fall, that burgundy foliage actually turns to an orange-red, stunning plant. This particular variety will get about 5 to 6 foot tall and wide, and is a beautiful addition to your xeric garden. The Pawnee Butte sand cherry is another native plant found out by the Pawnee Buttes. And you can see in this picture here is a beautiful, it has a white flower in the spring and then a nice form to it. It stays very low, only getting about 18 inches tall and spreading probably 5 to 6 foot wide. And then it gets a stunning reddish orange fall color. This would be a great one for erosion control. As well as there's another one that I'll show you that'll be coming up, which would be another good one for that too. It also makes a little sand cherry, which is a little purple cherry. Again, was used for making jams and jellies if you can get your hands on it before the birds. So it has many seasons, I think, of good features to consider this plant in your garden. The fernbush is another favorite no-water plant for me. This one here has really nice ferny foliage to it, a white flower that comes on in the midsummer when not too many other things are blooming, and then this interesting yellow fall color that you can see here. It gets about 5 to 6 foot tall and 5 to 6 foot wide. This plant will grow with absolutely no additional water. So this would not be one you would want to put next to your bluegrass, although if it wasn't staying too soppy, it probably would live there, but it would probably grow and get real floppy because it would grow too fast and too tall with that additional amount of water. This is a plant that does not want a lot of water. The Apache Plume is a very interesting native plant. Again, a drought-resistant plant, not requiring any additional water. This is one you either love or you hate. It tends to be a little bit kind of scraggly in appearance in the winter, but it has these beautiful, it makes a white flower all throughout the season that is followed by these little fluffy, feathery seed pods that are supposed to resemble an Indian bonnet, which is why they call it the Apache plume. And I believe that one of the Native American tribes believed that it was a cure for, or to help grow hair. They would make a tea out of the seeds of this thing for a hair growth tonic. So it has many uses, I'm sure, to the Native Americans. Great plant, though, for those really tough areas in your yard. You can see here it's a great contrast plant, too, for evergreens and other varieties of native plants that are very xeric. The fernleaf buckthorn is another great small tree or large shrub. This plant here is probably my second or third or fifth. I don't know. You can tell I really like plants. So, but in the spring, it has a lime green new growth to it. In the summer, its foliage is very ferny, almost has an Asian feel to it. It's a great textural plant. In the fall, it turns this brilliant gold color to it. And even in the wintertime, the bark has lenticels on it. It's a gray bark with white speckles on it. So very interesting form even in the winter. The Gro-Low Sumac is another plant that's a great erosion control plant that gives you the red fall color, spreads very low on the ground, only getting about 3 foot tall. So this would be a great xeric, no water, native plant. We have the autumn amber sumac, which is a cousin to that. This one is only 18 inches tall. It tends to lack the fall color that the other one has, but spreads much wider, 10, 12 foot wide in its spread. You can see in the lower picture on the right that it just kind of creeps and crawls along the ground or over anything in its way. Staghorn sumac is another great one for fall color, interesting seeds that the birds like. This plant here will sucker, so unless you want to put it out in the far reaches, so staghorn is more of a larger shrub, beautiful fall colors you can see in this picture, interesting seed pods through the winter, but this plant here will sucker, and you will be dealing with trimming back suckers or allowing it to form a colony in the area that you plant it. The golden currant is another survivor from the Cheyenne Station. It is a native plant. Beautiful yellow flowers in the spring, makes a berry that the birds love, and a stunning red fall color. This plant was also used, the Native Americans used it to make a dye, to dye their clay pots, and the flowers are actually edible, so if you like to make pretty salads, you could put these flowers on your salad. Allegheny viburnum would be a shrub that you could use for screening. This is a very large shrub. You need a large space for this plant. Grows 8 to 10 foot tall, equally as wide. Has clusters of white flowers in the spring and then followed by these interesting berries late into the season. The leaves are leathery, very thick and textural. Great screening plant. You can see how large it is. This picture is taken out at PERC. And the yellowhorn, I think this is my last slide here. This is a very interesting introduction. It's a plant select. It has an orchid-type white flower in the spring. This would be a great specimen tree for a focal point in your garden. Small tree, large shrub, depending on how you prune it. Very different. This tree is actually planted right in front of the gardens on Spring Creek if you want to see it throughout the season, but in its glory in this picture right here in flower. The Panchito Manzanita is a great plant for Colorado. It's a cousin to the Kinnicknick. It's a low-growing broadleaf evergreen. Can be grown in very dry locations. It's a spreader. Only gets about 12 to 18 inches tall and will spread 4 to 5, maybe even 6 foot wide. Has a pretty little pink flower in the spring. Another underused plant is the curl-leaf mountain mahogany. This is a large shrub or a small tree. You can see in this picture here, it's been limbed up to a small tree. It has an interesting fuzzy seed pod, can actually be grown without water, and is a wonderful native plant for Colorado landscapes. The Bluestem Joint Fir is another interesting blue color that can be contrasted with other plants in your garden. It actually is almost leafless, but it has these, it's a cousin to the Ephedra. It is in the Ephedra family, but there's a native green variety. This one is the blue variety. It is plant select. You can see how pretty it is with the purple flowers and the pink flowers here at the Kendrick Lakes Gardens. It's a great plant for a totally dry garden, again. It can also be used for erosion control. The common juniper is a native plant to Colorado, grows in the higher elevations, foothills to the montane, prefers to have some shade, so this is a plant that you can use in the shade, an evergreen, has an interesting little blue berry and stays fairly low to the ground, growing about 18 inches high and maybe 3 to 4 foot wide. And there's many juniper species that are worthy of consideration in shrubs for ground covers. You can see here the icy blue or the tam, and there's also many other cultivars that I think are good to consider for those very, very tough sites in our landscapes where we do not want to irrigate or very exposed. The Fremont Desert Holly is another native plant that grows without any additional water, broadleaf evergreen. Its leaves are very spiny, but also very blue, so it gives you an interesting color to play off of. And then we have our yuccas. This here, I'm just showing you a couple of varieties that are not our native. There's a banana yucca and the red yucca, which is from Texas again. But it's an interesting form that you can use for structure in your garden as focal points in those totally dry gardens. And also cactus gardens. The cactus, there's many varieties of cactus that are cold hardy. This is the gardens in Arvada, Timberline Gardens. You can see it in bloom and the different colors and textures that are available through many of the Apuntia species of cactus. I have a few vines that I'll introduce you to for Colorado. The first one is a trumpet vine, which is a very rampant, fast-growing vine. It's very large, needs a very sturdy support, has a beautiful orange long flower, makes a pod, and the hummingbirds love this thing, but you do need a very sturdy support for this particular plant. The Sweet Autumn Clematis is another wonderful fast-growing vine. This one tendrils its way up. It needs to have something to climb on, a netting or poles or so forth. It blooms late in the season with a white flower that is very, very fragrant. You can see it covering a fence here or crawling up the side, and it'll actually crawl over the top of that pergola in that picture or on the arbor. This is a wonderful hardy plant for Colorado for a vine. The trumpet honeysuckle is another favorite of butterflies and hummingbirds, and it also makes a berry that holds through the winter that the birds will come and eat off of all winter long. There's many varieties of the sempervirens. This one is blanched sandman. Some are fragrant, some are more orange and red, but this is a great vine. It needs a trellis. It'll vine That's how it grows, by vining stems, so it needs something to support it as it grows. The Virginia creeper is another very prolific vine. It actually will crawl up things with little feet, and it makes a beautiful blueberry and then that stunning red fall color, but it is a rampant grower, but very hardy for those tough spots where you really want something that's going to vine and crawl and take over. This one will do that. And the silver lace vine is another one of those very drought tolerant, will grow without water, very vigorous vines requiring a very heavy support. It's very interesting white lacy type flowers, but you can see its growth habit, how rampant it does grow and how it covers these fences, and then what it looks like in the wintertime with that growth in place. So through the seasons, these are pictures in my yard. When you use these xeric plants and you put them in combination, you've got a plan of how you want to approach things. You can see that seasonally you can create beauty. And the spring in the lower left picture, in the fall is the same shot as it's changed through the seasons. And with the structure of the plants and repetition and balance, you can see even in the winter it can be quite stunning.
During this half of the program, I'm looking forward to introducing you to a variety of attractive, interesting, and in some cases, unusual grasses and perennials. You'll find again that some of the plants listed on your handout are not included in the presentation. It's always too many plants, too little time. Having said that, there's still a lot of plants that we're going to be covering this evening, so fasten your seatbelts, we'll get started. You often see grasses and perennials referred to as herbaceous plants. Those are plants that do not produce woody tissue like the trees and the shrubs, and they generally die back at the end of each growing season. They survive the winter as dormant underground structures. More and more I see that people are finding and appreciating the use, the beauty, and the benefits of planting ornamental grasses in their landscapes, and so that's where I'm going to start in tonight's presentation. So the question is, why plant ornamental grasses? All I need to do is look at this slide and I know exactly why I love to use ornamental grasses in my landscapes. You've got an array of wonderful colors, you've got interesting textures, you've got a variety of sizes and shapes, you have movement and sound when the wind blows, and the ornamental grasses make beautiful companion, low water companion plants for our colorful perennials. So I wanted to start out with just some basic information about growing and maintaining ornamental grasses. First of all, your grasses will either be clump forming or they'll be runners. And the clump forming grasses are generally more compact and they're easier to control. They'll grow by just sort of moving outward from the base of the plant. The runners actually send underground runners through the soil, and they can often be aggressive spreaders. Your grasses will either be cool season or they'll be warm season. The cool season grasses, like the Karl Forster feather reed grasses that you see already around town that may be 6-7 inches above the ground already, are those that start to grow as soon as the temperatures rise above freezing in the spring. They begin flowering then in the early summer. The warm season grasses, like some of our native little blue stems, big blue stem, the maiden grasses, are warm weather grasses, and they require the soil to be warm before they start growing. So you won't usually see those grasses coming up until mid-spring. With regard to cutting back grasses, it helps to know whether or not your grasses are cool season or warm season. If it's a cool season grass, you'll want to have already cut it back by this time of year. I usually think late February, early March is the best time to do that, because you'll see already a lot of the feather reed grasses starting to emerge in early March, and you don't want to end up cutting off the top of those new grass blades when you're trying to cut back the old grass. The warm season grasses you can leave in your landscape a little bit longer, cut them back maybe in late April or even early May, depending on the kind of winter that we have. The warm season grasses, because they take longer to emerge in the spring, are nice if you leave them up They make a pretty backdrop for some of our spring blooming bulbs. And if you cut them back early, you leave a hole or a gap in your garden until they start to emerge in the spring. So spacing plants, that's pretty much an individual choice. The clump formers you can use individually so that the form of each individual plant is visible, or you can plant them in groups to create a screen or a drift of color and texture. If you think about all of the feather reed grasses that are planted along I-25 near Centera, hundreds of those grasses, those are planted in a mass for impact, but you don't notice the individual form of each plant as much. The runners do have their place in the landscape. They're great for use for erosion control or as a ground cover. All of the grasses that I'll be talking about in tonight's presentation, however, are clump grasses, no runners. So starting with one of our warm season native big bluestem, this grass is really outstanding for a number of reasons. It's got great drought and heat tolerance, and you can see it's got beautiful red, rich red foliage in the fall. And you can see the winter foliage sort of fades to a red-orange in the late winter. You may find this grass sometimes listed as turkeyfoot or bluestem or blue joint turkeyfoot because the flowers on this grass are a three-pronged flower that often look like an upside-down turkeyfoot. This is overdam variegated feather reed grass, and it's very similar to Karl Forester, except that it has some white variegation in the leaf blades, where Karl Forester is entirely green. This is a cool season grass, and you can see that it blooms in the summer with flowers that are tinged with kind of a purplish pink color, and those flowers then start to tighten up in the fall as the season gets cooler, and they form those beautiful golden seed heads that you see in the picture on your left. And this is one of the things you'll want to notice with ornamental grasses is that you get wonderful, almost a glowing light to the grasses when they're backlit by the early morning sun or the late afternoon sun. This is another one of the feather reed grasses. It's the same genus, it's the Calamagrostis genus, but it's a different species. And this particular grass is a warm season grass. So these flowers don't emerge on this grass until very late in the season, often early fall. So as beautiful as these pinkish plumes are on this grass, the show may be short-lived because this grass can easily get flattened by an early snowstorm. But again, it's a warm season grass, so it takes a little bit longer for everything to emerge in the spring. But it has a rounder, more fuller growth habit than the taller, more narrow feather reed grasses that I showed you earlier. And this is another grass for us. For some of you, if you're looking for plants that would work well in a part shade situation, this is the plant. I think it's an underused ornamental grass in our landscapes. The seed heads you can see look like oats. They're pretty showy, and the foliage is reminiscent of that of bamboo. So it's a pretty interesting grass. Would work really well in a smaller space with either full sun or part sun. This plant only gets about 2.5 feet high and wide. This is blue avena grass. You may also know this as blue oat grass. Same plant, two different common names. It has a beautiful form. You see the really round, symmetrical, fine, almost metallic blue foliage that set up the flowers almost 2 feet above the foliage. It's beautiful planted in mass, and it's beautiful, as you can see, and it's as an individual plant. And it's a nice foil for the fleshy green leaves of the sedum in this picture, the larger picture in the slide. And this grass is an exception to some of the pruning information that I gave you earlier. This particular grass needs some grooming in the spring, but basically you can just cut off the top part of the grass with a gloved hand, get in there and pick out some of the dead foliage, but it doesn't need the severe pruning that most or all of the other ornamental grasses need. This is Mexican feathergrass, and it's probably one of the most delicate, graceful of the smaller ornamental grasses. It has super fine foliage. You can see how beautifully the seed heads glow in the sunlight and they sway gently in the breeze. This would be a good grass to use in a naturalized area since it likes to hop around in your garden. You can see that it's not picky about the soil that it chooses to grow in. It's growing right here along the flagstone pathway and in the rocks along in this garden. This is switchgrass, and switchgrasses are another one of my favorites, primarily because there's so much variety within this genus. You can find grasses that only get 3 feet tall or that get as tall as 8 feet with the seed heads. Most of them have a more narrow, upright growth habit, although some, like Shenandoah, which has red foliage, tends to be almost as wide as it is tall, 3 to 4 feet. The prairie fire, like the Shenandoah, has the red foliage. The plants have a lot of variety. The Dallas Blues is a really pretty wide blade with a blue-green color to it. Northwind is an excellent plant if you're looking for something that won't fall over when the snow comes. It stays very upright throughout the winter season. And again, that one has a bright green leaf to it. And all of the switchgrasses have a really light, airy, almost a red tinged seed head. And so they're not real obvious, but they're pretty when the light hits them just right. This one is not just among my favorites, this is one of my favorites. I mean, it is my favorite of the grasses. It's a fountain grass, and it actually makes a good substitute for the purple fountain grass. A lot of people love the purple fountain grass that's an annual for us. This is a perennial fountain grass that sets up beautiful pink flowers in the early summer, and it blooms pretty much through the entire season into the fall. These pictures were taken, at least the two, the bottom one and the larger one on the right, at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and you can see the pink seed heads in the early morning light. But you can also see the impact that that grass makes when it's planted in a mass along the front edge of that water feature. This is a warm season grass. And this is another one of our natives, very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant. This is one of our little blue stems. This is Blaze, and it maintains that red color through the winter time. It's not very tall, so if you're looking for a grass that has more of a narrow growth habit and only gets about 2 to 3 feet tall, this would be a good choice. It's pretty as an individual accent in the garden, and it's also pretty planted in a mass like this. This is another one of our little blue stem grasses. It's called the Blues. And I really like this grass, and you can see that it has a bluer green leaf, but as it's changing for the fall, turning to its red color, it takes on almost some purplish hues, and so it pulls out a lot of the color of that blackjack sedum in front of it. And just for reference, so that you can see how interesting the grasses are as the seasons change, this picture is those very same grasses during the middle of the winter. And you can see now that they reflect the color or echo the color in those sedums as their seed heads have dried, become kind of a russet red. The grass is the same, and they look really pretty set against the backdrop, or with the giant sequoia in the backdrop. And this is what not to do. I went to show a friend how beautiful these ornamental grasses were. They were planted all along this parkway, and this was December. And I thought, oh, the late afternoon light, it's going to be gorgeous. And they were all cut down. So you can see even cut, they're still really pretty. But can you imagine how gorgeous that would have been in the late afternoon light if they were still standing tall? This is giant Saskatoon. This is another one of our native grasses, and a very tough, low water or no water grass once it's established. This picture was taken down at the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. It's a great place to go if you want to see some examples of native plants, low water plants, just about everything there is in the plant world. But this one can get 4 to 6 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide, and even though it's a large grass, because the leaf blades are very narrow and the seed heads are very delicate, it doesn't really have a lot of mass in the garden. So it's beautiful as an individual specimen, but you can plant these closer together and form a nice screen, a wind screen, or just a visual screen if that's what you're looking for. And then the last of the grasses that I'll be presenting tonight is another one of my favorites. This is prairie dropseed. It's a native. It's very low water. You can see it has a nice round form. It sets up delicate seed heads, and this grass turns a really pretty golden orange in the fall. And as an added benefit, you could use this grass in a fragrant garden, because the seed heads, if you rub them between your fingers, smell a lot like cilantro. Some people think popcorn, I think cilantro, but it's just another nice benefit to this plant. And I think it's appropriate to end this section with a plant that has been referred to as the hair of the earth. So moving right into perennials, starting with a really rugged, low-growing, super low water, evergreen perennial. This is Serbian yarrow, and it stays evergreen. You can see the foliage with the flowers is a nice gray-green. The winter color is almost a silver green. And then that sets up the flowers almost 4 to 5 inches above the foliage, and it will start blooming now within the next week or two, and it's a fairly long bloomer. It'll bloom for about 3 to 4 weeks. But it's nice. This would be a great plant if you have a slope, sunny, dry, on the south or west facing part of your property. This would be an excellent plant to use to help anchor that slope and give you year-round interest. This is Sonoran Sunset Hyssop, and I don't know if you're familiar with the hyssops or not, but they're wonderful hummingbird magnets. They have a tremendous fragrance. This particular one smells like bubble gum, and it has kind of a raspberry red flower. The beauty of these particular plants is that they bloom pretty much from midsummer through frost, and you don't need to do any deadheading. So this is another one of the hyssops. This one's my favorite. It's sunset hyssop, and it's actually probably one zone more cold hardy than the Sonoran sunset. It has a gray-green leaf that's a little bit more narrow, and these pictures were both taken in the fall, so the color's a little bit more intense because the days have started getting cooler. But the hyssops attract bees as well as hummingbirds, but they're absolutely wonderful plants to have. They will self-sow some in your garden, but you know, if you have to pull out a few little seedlings, then your gloves or your fingers smell like licorice or mint, because that's what these plants smell like. They're often referred to as hummingbird mint because the hummingbirds are greatly attracted to this plant. They're actually best if you leave them through the winter and cut them back in the spring. It will help just with their cold hardiness, help them to overwinter a little bit more successfully. This is Mount Atlas daisy, and this is a low-growing, mat-forming, spring-blooming perennial that is, like the Serbian yarrow, a very tough plant. Its beauty really belies its strength. It has a pretty big daisy for the size of the foliage, with a large yellow center, and underneath the white petals, it's painted a red color. But this is a plant that will also self-sow in your yard, and it's not very particular about where it does that. Again, in gravel along flagstone pavers, but it's beautiful. It emerges very early in the spring, so it gives you, again, some of that gray-green color and a nice mat-forming perennial if you're looking for something just to spread in and fill that won't require any water once it's established. This is orange butterfly weed, and I love it for the burst of orange that it gives to the early summer garden. It's beautiful planted next to lavender or some of our purple salvias, nice complementary colors. And it gets to be a fairly large plant once it's been in for a couple years. Excuse me. It'll get about 2.5 feet, maybe even 3 feet tall, but 2.5 feet wide. And then I love it for those beautiful tapered seed pods that form on the plant. Thank you. And the silky seeds then that they produce. It has a really pretty structure during the winter. Some of the pod stays on the plant, and so you can see that it has interest for all 4 seasons. And it is called butterfly weed for a reason. It's definitely a plant that the tiger swallowtails love to visit. And like no day should be complete without chocolate, no xeric garden could be complete without a chocolate flower. This is a wonderful plant, again, a Southwest native. This one will get about 18 inches tall and maybe 2 feet wide. You can see from the picture on the left that it has a little bit of a sprawling growth habit, but it smells very much like a deep, dark, rich chocolate bar. And the scent of this plant is going to be the strongest in the morning. So I would suggest if you plant it in your garden that you plant it along the edge of your pathway where you can smell that chocolate as you're coming and going, gathering the paper or doing whatever. But it has pretty ornamental seed heads, and this plant is a self-sower, so you will have chocolate plant coming up in a few other places in your garden. This is a good plant for dry shade. So I don't know if any of you here are looking for plants that would work in a dry shade situation, but this is one. It's called False Forget-Me-Not because it sets up those tiny blue forget-me-not-like flowers. It's probably a mid-spring bloomer. This was blooming in May. And it can, because the foliage is large, it makes an interesting addition to the garden just for the texture and the color that it gives. This is another Brunera. This is Jack Frost. And again, you can see it with the blue flowers, but even when this plant isn't flowering, the silver variegation in that foliage is absolutely beautiful. There are other varieties of this plant as well, some that have even more silver variegation, some with cream variegation, but this is a good plant. You can see this one growing along some flagstone steps and rocks near a water feature, so it's a good plant for shade. This is the 1,000-flowered aster. And again, I really love this plant. You'll probably find it, when you find it available, it'll probably be listed as calamint, but you know, a common name. So if you ask for it by name, Calamintha nipida subspecies nipida, this is what you'll get. It's nice to put in your garden because the bees love it. And it doesn't start blooming until kind of mid to late summer, so it's a way to get a little bit of color and interest into your garden later in the year when a lot of other things have stopped blooming. And this one is prairie wine cups or purple poppy mallow. This plant actually spreads quite a bit. It will reseed itself, but looking at this picture, in the front part of this slide, you may only have 3 plants there because each plant grows from a very deep taproot and then spreads out. I went to share some of mine with a friend once and I picked it up and I'm like, oh, you know, it's just this whole big thing with one big taproot. And it does really rather resent being transplanted, but you can do it, give it a little time to recover. But again, it does self-sow, so you will see this growing up in your garden in various places, but it does bloom throughout the summer, doesn't get real tall, maybe only 6 to 12 inches, and so it's a nice addition. It's very pretty planted with anything yellow. The sundrops is a particularly nice combination, and I'll show you those in a minute. Here's another plant for dry shade. This one's great to add to the garden if you want a pop of color late in the season. This hardy plumbago or leadwort is very slow to wake up in the spring, and I think that's mostly because it has its big show in the fall. but it has almost an electric blue flower, and you can see that it's still flowering even as the foliage starts to turn that pretty burgundy color in the late summer and early fall. It dies back, so it's just kind of reddish brown stems during the winter, but again, to get some color in the garden at a time of the year when a lot of things have finished blooming, this is a great plant. This is ice plant, and many of you might be familiar with the purple ice plant. It will bloom throughout the entire summer. It dies back in the winter, so it's not much to look at in the winter. The hardy yellow, if you like the yellow, that particular ice plant just gets smothered with yellow flowers in June. But when it's done blooming, it's done for the summer, but the foliage is very nice. It's that bright green, and it turns a really pretty ruby red in the winter. So you can decide. You get color for 3 weeks in the summer and then interest all year round, or you can go with the purple and have color all summer and then not much happening in the winter. Same with Mesa Verde. It blooms pretty much through the summer, but it dies back completely in the fall and winter. Bleeding Hearts I added to this presentation mostly because it's a plant that all of you would probably recognize, but I think it's fun to mention because it has a clever way of dealing with drought. The Bleeding Hearts are already starting to bloom. I noticed one in my neighbor's yard that's already blooming. Mine's on the north side of the house, and it's emerging, but it's not close to blooming yet. It'll probably wait until around Mother's Day. But these plants take advantage of the light and the moisture in the spring, and then they go dormant in the heat of the summer. They're basically programmed to go dormant when the days get really hot, and this plant in its dormancy does not require a lot of water, so it's great. Early spring color, and then it pretty much just disappears from your garden in the middle of the summer. Purple coneflower. The traditional coneflower is the purple coneflower. There's been a lot of breeding that's been done, and so there are now coneflowers available in a lot of different colors, in a lot of different forms. I still prefer the purple coneflower. This section of my yard started out with 5 little plants, and I've given a lot away. I just let them all go to seed and fill in that space, and I leave the seed heads up because the birds love those during the winter time. And if and when we get snow, I think they look pretty with their little snow-capped seed heads. I also have a few of the orange meadow bright coneflowers planted in my yard. They're beautiful, but they don't seem to be as floriferous. They don't put up as many flowers. They don't reseed as much as my purple coneflowers, and they're still there, except for the one the dog stepped on, but they come back every year, but I don't have any more. I only have the original ones that I planted. This is a great plant if you like prickly plants. The bees love this plant, this blue globe thistle. Again, something that will give you some color in that middle to late summertime. It is a very bold specimen plant, if that's what you're looking for in your garden. You can see that it has a large, deeply cut leaf and a very round blue flower. The leaves on this plant, the bottom leaves tend to deteriorate fairly quickly, so if you can plant something at the base of that plant that kind of covers up the deteriorating leaves, it's a good idea. But this is beautiful. I mean, this blue is so almost metallic that everything, you can see a little bit of the red rose in that one picture. It's pretty with the sunset hyssop with the orange. I mean, it's a wonderful plant. It is a self-sower. I haven't had it reseed itself in my yard a lot. This is the first time in 3 years I actually had one little seedling, but I know Ann's had it in her yard, and then she took it out of her yard because she had so many of them growing up. So, you know, your experience might be different, but I think it's really worth planting just for the interesting structure that it gives. This is a native for us. This is Canna Creek buckwheat, and this is another perennial that's beautiful all year round. You can see just a profusion of yellow flowers that show up in the kind of late spring. Then those flowers age to this orange color, but the foliage does not die back. It just changes to that magnificent burgundy. And then when spring comes, the foliage just greens up again and starts the whole process all over. So this is a great plant. It stays fairly low and good for year-round interest. This is a wonderful little ground cover, again, for a place of dry shade. It's pretty small, only gets about 4 or 5 inches high, and those little white star-shaped flowers are pretty tiny. The foliage starts out bright green in the spring and then becomes a little darker green as the season progresses. But one of the things that I love about this perennial, and what my dog must love as well, is that even though it's a plant that tolerates really dry shade, it gives you the feeling of a shaded woodland garden. I mean, growing underneath, and you can see it self-sows, but growing around the base of those aspen trees and around the shrub, it just feels like it should be in a woodland area and not someplace that's getting very little irrigation. And coral bells, another one of my all-time favorites. And the coral bells got their name from the wands of nodding red flowers that they send up, but it's really the foliage and the texture, or the texture and the color of the foliage that is the reason most people plant coral bells. And this is just a tiny sampling of what's available with the coral bells. They're kind of like the coneflowers. Every year there's something new and exciting. But these plants I really like because regardless of whether you've got a sunny garden or whether you've got a shady garden, there's something for everyone. It's primarily the green-leaved coral bells that tolerate full sun. The darker ones and sometimes the brighter ones like the lime ricky can take full shade. Others can take some combination of part shade, part sun, whatever, anything in between. But there are just so many beautiful colors and textures and sizes of leaves. And another nice thing about them is depending on the severity of our winter, the leaves may persist through the winter time while the plant's dormant. So in the spring, all you need to do is clean up a few ragged leaves and you're good to go for another summer. But they're really beautiful, and again, for anything from full sun to full shade. This is variegated iris, and I know the irises are really tough and drought tolerant, and so are the variegated varieties. They're very pretty. There's either white variegation or there's the yellow variegation. And you can see in the photograph at the bottom how pretty the foliage is when the sun is coming through those leaves in the late afternoon. The flowers are wonderfully fragrant. They smell just like grape Kool-Aid. And what's nice about them is that the foliage starts emerging very early in the spring. It's one of the first things to start showing up in my garden. And the foliage is beautiful through the summer. So, you know, even at night when I walk out and I look at that, it glows. It would make a nice plant to put in a moon garden just because of the white variegation on that foliage. It's very pretty, very drought tolerant, and good kind of 2, almost 3 season grass. Another good plant for those of you with dry shade. These are the spotted dead nettle. They only get about 6 to 8 inches tall, and they will grow pretty much in part shade to full shade. The flowers are pretty, but most people grow this plant again for its foliage. You can see golden anniversary down there with yellow, deep green, and silver all on one leaf. You've got pink pewter that's mostly silver with a little bit of green on the edge, and lots of other varieties, White Nancy, Beacon Silver, Orchid Frost. There's Red Nancy that isn't really a red flower. It's almost the color of the Beacon Silver, maybe a little bit more pink in it. But it's a great, fast-growing ground cover for a shady spot. This is another one of our natives, and if you're interested in planting a prairie garden or a meadow garden, this would be a great plant to use. It adds a vertical accent to the garden, and you can see, if you haven't deadheaded it, that it I think makes a really interesting plant in the wintertime. One thing that's kind of unique about the liatris or the gay feather, blazing star, is that these flowers start blooming from the top down, where most flowers bloom from the bottom up. So the advantage is that when those blooms at the top of this flower start to fade and turn brown, you can just snip that off and enjoy the pretty fresh flowers on the lower part of the stem. So this is a great one, though. You see it growing in the foothills, in the prairies, and it's wonderful if you want to use it in that kind of a garden. The desert four-o'clock, another one of our native wildflowers. This plant is absolutely stunning. When it's mature, it'll get about 1 to 2 feet tall, 4 to 6 feet wide, and it will have hundreds of flowers all blooming at the same time. It's very impressive, and it's one of those plants that will do best for you with very little irrigation. These are sundrops, another one of our native plants and another one of those really rugged, low water perennials. This plant blooms starting in June, all summer, with these beautiful 3 to 4 inch bright yellow flowers, and you can see that the seed pods are really interesting. They're four-sided, they're like a winged seed pod, and those seed pods they just dry and are tan, or they turn a tan color in the winter, and they're beautiful to use in dried arrangements as well. There are several different varieties of sundrops. You have silver blade down there on the bottom, where the foliage is mostly sort of a silver green as opposed to the bright green. There are some with a much narrower leaf as well. I'm just going to go over a few basics regarding planting penstemons and then whip through a few slides. The most important thing with penstemons, as with a lot of our native plants, is that you need to have sharp draining soil. Wet soil spells certain death for penstemons. And go light on fertilizer. They like it lean. Oops. Planting penstemons, it's great if you can plant them just a little bit above grade, a little bit higher than the surrounding soil, so that water doesn't collect around the crown of the plant and rot it. And the crown of the plant is where the roots meet the leaves. With deadheading, a lot of the penstemons are not real long-lived for us, so if you let some of your penstemons set seed by not cutting them back, that's probably a good idea. And often the resulting seedlings will live longer and be more durable than the parent plant. And finally, cutting down penstemons. A lot of websites or magazines will tell you cut them down in the fall. I say leave them until the spring and cut them back then. The old stems really help protect the crown of the plant during the winter. You'll find lots of variety within the penstemons in terms of size and color and even shape for some of the flowers, although they're all very similar to the kind of snapdragon-like flower. This is a native forest firecracker penstemon with that rich red. This was a plant select plant, Pikes Peak Purple. This one is a pretty vigorous reseeder, and so you would want to deadhead this midway through the season, and then it'll set up more blooms. You might want to deadhead it again, and it'll rebloom, but you will find this in various places throughout your garden because it is a pretty ready reseeder. Again, 3 other varieties of penstemon. The pine leaf penstemon, the yellow one at the top, is really a nice choice if you want something evergreen in your garden. That really narrow pine-like foliage lasts all year round. You just cut off the flowers in the fall and you've got a pretty mat of green during the winter. The red rocks is another plant select, and my all-time favorite is that electric blue. It hasn't lived really long in my gardens, but 2 or 3 years seems to be what I get out of it, but you know what, I would plant it as an annual. It's just so pretty. And this one a lot of you might be familiar with. This is Russian sage. It gets to be a fairly large plant. 4 feet by 4 feet when it's mature. It's a very long blooming, you can see again with the little X'd out water droplet, very tough perennial forest. And something interesting about this plant is that it's actually classified as a subshrub. So you'll find Russian sage often available in the woody plants at your nursery as well as in the perennial section. And because this plant doesn't die back completely, you'll want to wait until the spring and then cut it back maybe 8–10 inches from the ground. This is another one of our native wildflowers, the pasque flower, so called because it's often blooming right around Easter time. It blooms in colors, different shades of purple, red, white, and this little yellow one. It's another really low water plant. It has a real pretty ferny foliage. It only gets about 8, maybe 10 inches tall, but then these flowers will give way to really showy, feathery seed heads later in the season. And this is one, if any of you are interested in planting a prairie garden, that will do really well for you. You can see it's one of our natives. It readily reseeds and will often outpace some of the other wildflowers in your garden, so you do maybe want to cut some of these back if you want to allow other things to come up between it. But it's really tough, low water, do great. This is Caradonna salvia, one of the purple salvias. This particular one I have a preference for, one, because I love the dark purple stems, and two, because those dark purple stems are a little sturdier than some of the other purple salvias, and so this plant is not as likely to flop as some of the other ones are. This plant will rebloom for you as long as you keep cutting it back. I just take the whole thing, cut it back to about, by about half. It reblooms, cut it back again, it reblooms, continues until frost. This one I had to put in just because it's so cute. The redbirds in a tree actually gets to be a fairly large perennial. This one started out as just a little plant. It's a fast grower. In my front yard, this plant got a solid 6 feet tall. These plants like to, they have an informal growth habit, which is just a nice way of saying that they lean a bit. So if you can plant them next to a shrub or a grass or something where they can get a little support, that would be great. But they're so beautiful, and like the penstemons, if you want to bring hummingbirds into your yard, this will do it with those cherry red flowers. This is one of many tall sedums, and this is my absolute favorite because it's a little sturdier than some of the others, but it's beautiful all year. Very early in the spring, you see that mound of fleshy green foliage appearing. Late summer, you get those pretty rose pink flowers, and you can see even in the snow that this plant stays upright and sturdy, and it's just, I hate to cut it back in the spring because it still looks good, but I'm seeing all the new growth coming underneath. But it's a wonderful choice for a low water garden with, where you want some winter interest. This is orange carpet hummingbird trumpet. Also, I think this was also a plant select. I can't remember what year, but another hummingbird plant, as you can tell from the name. It's a low growing spreader. And this is a very fast grower. If you want something on a slope or in an area that you want to cover quickly, this one will do that. You can put in a small plant and it'll be a large plant before the summer's over. But again, scarlet red flowers, and it's a fairly long bloomer. Starts kind of midsummer and into the later part of the season. And finally, ending with one of our native wildflowers again, the Rocky Mountain zinnia, sometimes known as paper flower. This is one of those plants that will dare to grow where no other plant would think of going. It will take anything. I just popped this in my yard in an area near a walkway, which is sitting in a little bit of soil and a lot of road base, and it's doing great. It's slow to wake up in the spring, so you may think it's dead, but it's not. Give it a little time. It'll start blooming mid to late summer, and then it'll go all the way through frost. But if you need a plant that will grow where almost nothing else will, this would be a great one for that. And I just wanted to remind you that in addition to all of the pretty grasses and perennials, don't forget that planting fall bulbs that will give you spring blooms is a great way to add some additional interest and color to your gardens. And these are the ornamental onions. This is growing over at PERC in their the Plant Environmental Research Center. This picture was taken in late May. These are probably ornamental onion giganteum. They get flowers on them about 6 inches wide and can set up flower stalks as high as 4 feet tall. This is a native for us, a nodding onion, gets about 18 inches tall, really easy to identify by those lilac pink nodding flowers. One thing I love about the ornamental onions is that the deer and the rabbits don't love them. And so I've pretty much given up on tulips because I just end up feeding the deer, but they don't eat my ornamental onions. This one is one of those unusual plants that I wanted to introduce you to. I absolutely love this. Not everybody thinks it's quite so interesting, but if you want a conversation piece in your garden, this will do it. I took these pictures, and the one where it's almost open, and those are actually the flower petals, those long green hair-like strands. And as that matures, there's a deep purple center to that plant. But interesting, and again, it comes up probably in early June. Another one of the ornamental onions that's absolutely stunning. This one's a little later blooming, mid-June, still looks pretty around the 4th of July. It looks like a fireworks flower. These flowers can reach a diameter of 15 inches. Absolutely beautiful, and they're already, you know, 6 or 8 inches out of the ground right now. So a gorgeous choice. The reticulated or snow irises are beautiful. This is the first plant that comes up in my garden. This one's usually blooming by late February. And you can see that the foliage doesn't come up with the flowers, but when those flowers fade, you're going to get foliage that comes up almost 18 inches tall, and so it makes for an interesting, almost grass-like plant in your garden during the early summer. And finally, the species tulips. These are small tulips that don't just tolerate drought, they actually demand drought. These are small tulips. You see on the bottom the Clusianas, Lady Jane, and the little Tarda tulips on the right. But anyhow, just some suggestions. There are some excellent mail order catalogs where you can find some of these species tulips if you're not able to find them locally. This is just a gentle reminder that all of these plants that Anne showed you and that I showed you, that even though they're very drought tolerant, will require regular watering until they are fully established, and that can take 2 to 3 years. So just keep that in mind, that once they're set, they're good to go. So what to do with all this information? Visit Display Gardens. We've got some resources on the back of your handout. Read inspiring books. Participate in local gardening classes, consult with your local nursery professionals or landscape designers, but most of all, just be brave. Get out there and plant. Thank you very much.